The Russian army buried their tanks underground out of fear. Ukrainian forces caught the Russian unit even underground. A strange reversal is taking place in this war. First, the fuel supply in Crimea was cut off. No one directly linked this to the front lines. Then, one by one, armored vehicles vanished from the Slovian front. It turned out they hadn't vanished. They had been buried underground, but that wasn't safe either. Now there is a much smaller, much stranger battle on the ground. The sky no longer searches for tanks or counts convoys. It is picking out a single silhouette, a single heat signature. That is why Russian troops are now planning not to advance, but to remain invisible. And at this point, we are confronted with an image reminiscent of a giant penguin walking across open terrain. This is not a scene of humor. It is a clear sign of how low the threshold for survival on the front line has fallen. This was no ordinary attack. The timing was no coincidence, nor was the target. The attack on the loading pier of the Faradiska oil depot in Crimea targeted the Russian army's mobility, not its strength on the front lines. The Ukrainian special forces did not hit a position, a vehicle, or a few soldiers here. They directly hit the fuel and lubrication chain. This point is critical because in modern warfare, fuel is not just fuel. Without fuel, tanks cannot move, armored vehicles cannot advance, and generators fall silent. Without lubrication, even if the engine runs, it will seize up quickly. In other words, this attack was a move aimed at effectively slowing down Russian forces heading towards the Dnieper. The operation was carried out by Ukrainian Special Operations Forces using locally produced FP-2 kamikaze drones. What is important here is not the detail that it was hit by a UAV, but what chain was broken. The convoy targeted in Vardisa was one of the last links in the fuel supply chain to the front. When this link was broken, the entire system behind it malfunctioned. But the picture does not end there. At the same time, another point near the Oryk line was targeted. In the Donetsk region, a Russian repair unit stationed near the village of Herna was hit. This was not a random choice. If you cannot repair vehicles damaged in battle, your losses double. Even if a tank is not hit, if it cannot be repaired, it is already out of commission. So on the one hand, the fuel supply is cut off, and on the other, the chances of existing vehicles getting back on their feet. Here we see the cost of a strained supply. When these two moves are read together, it is very clear that Ukraine's goal is not instant damage on the front line, but a disruption of continuity. The General Staff's emphasis on systematically reducing military economic potential describes this precisely. This is not a one-off raid. Indeed, between January 2nd and 7th, attacks were carried out on 21 separate targets deep inside Russia and in the occupied territories. More important than the number is the nature of the targets. UAV forces are particularly targeting logistics centers, ammunition depots, and fuel facilities in Zaporizhia, Luhansk, the Donetsk line, and Crimea. In other words, the targets are the back-end operations that keep the military afloat rather than the soldiers on the front lines. The next step is clear: airports and air bases. When fuel and logistics are under pressure, aviation activities naturally decrease. If planes cannot take off, the pilot skills become meaningless. The picture that emerges is this: Ukraine is not trying to crush the Russian army all at once. It is slowing down a structure that moves step by step, quietly but systematically. This slowdown may not be immediately apparent on the front lines, but at a certain point when fuel shortages, irreparable vehicles, and faltering air support combine, the picture changes. The real question is not how many vehicles were destroyed in this attack. The real question is, if this chain continues to break on which day, at which point on the front line will the result become visible? This time, Russia did not hide its tanks. It buried them underground. But Ukraine detected them even underground. And the reason it has come to this point is not a sudden decision taken on the Slovian line. It was a move made much earlier in Crimea. The fuel and lubricant shipment targeted near Farardis in Crimea did not put pressure on the troops on the ground, but on the system that moves those troops. When this chain falters, there is no immediate explosion on the front line, but the difference gradually becomes apparent. Vehicles arrive later, fewer arrive, and each part becomes more valuable. That is why, while different signals were coming from around Moscow and reports from Crimea were emerging one after another, the real pressure was felt on the Eastern Front, especially around Sloviansk. Russia shifted its main focus to Slovian after Pochersk. This is one of the key points on the Eastern Front. However, attempts made over a long period of time have not yielded the expected progress. The reason for this is not a numerical disadvantage. Progress is now controlled by the air. The approximately 15 kilometers area that Russian forces must traverse after crossing the Lyman line functions more like a filter than a passageway. Elements advancing in this area are constantly monitored. This alters the balance on the ground. Rather than moving, the forces focus on remaining unseen. Under these conditions, armored platforms become the only safe means of movement when advancing in open terrain. These vehicles allow personnel to avoid initial contact even if they are direct targets. In other words, even if these vehicles reveal their positions, they remain central to the plan on the ground. But here, the impact of the attack in Crimea comes into play again when the fuel and lubrication chain is under pressure. These vehicles reach the front less frequently. Deliveries arrive piecemeal. This leads to the following result. Vehicles are not used immediately. They are gathered. Once sufficient numbers are reached, movement is planned. But until then, these vehicles must be concealed. The first attempts were familiar, building gaps, intermediate points, temporary waiting areas. However, since Ukrainian drones know where to look, these vehicles are quickly detected. When the vehicles are pulled back too far, they lose their function. Progress is again impossible. At this point, a more unusual method comes into play. Armored vehicles are placed in deep pits, dug in forested and camouflaged areas. Their tops and sides are covered with soil. The goal is simple, to break up the silhouette when viewed from above. This method is effective in the initial phase. These vehicles are not visible in aerial scans. However, what remains invisible is the communication traffic. The vehicles may be underground, but the personnel inside must remain connected. This leaves a signal. The Ukrainian side narrows down specific points by tracking these signals. Once they know where to look, the terrain ceases to be an advantage. Drones directed to the area detect the armored vehicles covered with soil one by one. It turns out that a large number of vehicles around Lyman are hidden using this method. Then kamikaze drones come into play. The critical reality here remains unchanged. The armored vehicle may be underground, but the upper section cannot be completely sealed. The few layers of soil on top do not provide structural protection. This section is still vulnerable to an attack from above. For if there are no armored vehicles, fuel is limited and movement is delayed. Moving on foot becomes inevitable. But a moving foot soldier is almost naked against thermal systems. This is where unusual solutions began to appear in the field. Some Russian soldiers began using any kind of thermal cover they could get their hands on to avoid heat detection systems, emergency blankets, hunting ponchos, camping gear, even portable shelter fabric. The image may be strange, but the goal is clear. Leave no trace. In images shared by a drone team working with Ukrainian airborne troops, a silhouette resembling a giant penguin from a distance can be seen advancing in open treeless terrain during the daytime. Of course, there is no costume involved. This is a Russian soldier wearing a thermal poncho costing around $75. These ponchos work on a simple but effective principle. They are made of heat-trapping fabrics, often reinforced with metal fibers. The goal is to prevent body heat from escaping. For thermal cameras, this means the target blends into the surroundings. On snow-covered ground, under the right conditions, this type of poncho can really make a difference. Indeed, in the relevant images, this soldier is almost impossible to detect on the drone's thermal camera, so, in theory, the equipment used works. The breaking point here lies elsewhere. It appears that the detection was made using an optical camera, not a thermal one. Daytime conditions, open terrain, and a moving silhouette. All these factors combined meant that the advantages offered by the cloak could not be utilized. Then the kamikaze drone completed the process. This does not mean that the equipment is useless. On the contrary, It is very clear that if the same soldier had been moving at night or had remained under the cover of trees, he would most likely have been outside the detection chain. So the issue is not ridiculous-looking camouflage. The issue is how low the threshold for survival has been lowered. Today, the situation on the front lines has reached this point. Fuel is being hit. Vehicles are being hidden. Hidden vehicles are being located by signals, and individual movement is being detected by the intersection of thermal and optical sensors. That's why it's no longer just tanks, but even a single soldier who has to calculate whether to be visible or not. And this pressure is particularly intense in winter conditions, fog, snow, and cold. While providing cover on the one hand, they make thermal systems more meaningful on the other. The picture that emerges is this. On the front lines, it's no longer where you stand that matters, but which sensor you're caught by. And that's where the real question lies. If even a poncho has become a tactical necessity, how much lower will the next threshold in this war be? Because it seems that this pressure line has not yet bottomed out. At this point, the big picture is becoming clear. The fuel chain in Crimea has been pressured. Vehicles had to hide on the Slovian line, and now individuals are trying to become invisible on the field. This is less a tactical choice and more a chain of reflexes as the space narrows. What's striking here is that the pressure isn't coming down from above, but advancing layer by layer. First logistics, then armored units, now individual movement. Each step necessitates the previous one, and as this pressure increases, solutions become more temporary, more fragile. The real issue is not whether a poncho works or whether a vehicle can be hidden underground. The real issue is how sustainable these methods are, because remaining invisible may be possible for a while. But the moment you have to move, the balance shifts again. In the coming period, we will see the following on the field. Either a new balance will be established against this pressure, or another link in this chain will break. Which one it will be determined not by a single image, but by successive moves. Where do you think the next breaking point on this line will be? If this explanation has made why it is happening, not just that it is happening clearer to you, then liking the video is enough.